When people get to retirement, they're all asking the same questions. It's how do I get the money out, or do I sell monthly? And what happens if there's a market downturn? These are smart people. They've done a great job of saving, but they don't understand how to actually live off of their savings in retirement. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video, because you're no longer getting a paycheck. You now have to create your own paycheck. And so it's just some logistics and a bit of strategy as well. We'll talk about how you get the money into your bank account. We'll talk about taxes, how much you pay, when and why, and how, and what you can maybe do about that. We'll talk about the different types of accounts, which one you want to pull from and when, and then how much you can spend, or at least start talking about what spending looks like for retirees. So let's start with the most basic piece, which is how do you get the money from those investments into your bank account so that you can spend? So this is going to make up the gap between what you need to spend each month and what you might be getting from Social Security or a pension. Or if you haven't started your Social Security or pension yet, then you're entirely funding your spending out of these accounts. So the first step is you just link that account to a bank account. So maybe your savings are at Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard, for instance. You set up an electronic link and then you can move the money over within just a few business days. It's pretty easy once you get that set up. Now, you typically need to generate cash because the money might be in an investment like a mutual fund or an ETF. So to generate cash, you generally sell whatever it is you have. That goes into cash, often within about one business day. And then from there, you can zap it over to your bank account. So the question becomes, do you do this every month? Do you do it every 6 months, every year, and then kind of build up a pool of money that you're going to draw from so you don't have to log in every month? Or can you automate it? And those are all good questions. What I see is most people want a monthly income because that looks and feels like your previous income, but you can sell less frequently. Maybe you build up that pool of money for 6 months, something like that. And we're not talking about cash reserve just yet. We're just talking about what you're actually going to spend. So if you've got a portfolio of ETFs, you might say, I'm going to drum up 6 months worth of cash, log in there and do that. And then that money is available to put in your bank account. Now with mutual funds, you can actually automate this much more easily. That's where you can set up a systematic sale of some mutual fund shares, and that might happen a few days or a week or two maybe before the bank transfer. That way you sell the shares, it generates the cash is there ready, then you've got another automatic transfer that moves that money over to your bank account. So if you're doing it yourself and you like simplicity, mutual funds might be easier, but those aren't always what most people prefer to invest in. So you kind of have to make some choices. What do you sell? A lot of times it's nice to just sell whatever is up the most so that you are taking gains off of the table. Now, depending on the type of account you have, that can have tax consequences, or you might just sell proportionally to what you have to keep your balance where it is. But a lot of times, I think you're going to want to be rebalancing. So that means selling whatever is up the most so that you're taking off whatever piece of pie is too big, you're shaving that down to wherever it's supposed to be. Now, if you're just selling investments over time, you might run into a problem, and that is if the markets are down sharply, then you could be selling at a loss, and that can cause problems. We often hear of the sequence of returns risk. So if there's a big market downturn right at the beginning of your retirement, that can be problematic and can potentially have you running out of money sooner. So what do you do about that? Well, it's often good to have a cash buffer of some sort for these market downturns. So 1 year of cash buffer is often a good place to start. For you, the right amount might be more or less than that, longer or shorter than 1 year. But I think gravitating towards 1 year as a starting point, at least thinking about it, this isn't advice for you, but just something to think about. That's probably a good starting point. And the idea here is to avoid selling investments when they're down sharply, because again, that takes a bigger bite out of your portfolio. It will take more shares to generate the same amount of dollars if you're selling into a big market downturn. So if you have that cash reserve, you can avoid selling those shares at a steep loss. It effectively buys you some time so that you can hopefully see the market recover. Or maybe you're going to change your spending. Maybe you're going to make some adjustments. I don't want you to skip the vacation necessarily, but there may be some adjustments you can make so that you can spend a little bit less. Your cash reserve is often in something safe. That might be short-term, high-quality bonds. It might be money market funds. It might be CDs, might be treasury bills. There are all sorts of things you can pick to create that cash reserve. Again, I'm not advising that you do any of this, but these are just ideas for you to think about. Start researching this stuff and then make your own decisions. All right, so now that you've got some of the mechanics in place and you've got a buffer just in case there is a big market downturn, it's time to start thinking about taxes, because that is a reality in retirement. You're not done paying taxes just because you're done going to work. So how exactly do you pay taxes? There are two main ways to do this. One is through withholding, and then the other is through paying estimated taxes. So withholding happens when you take a withdrawal from an account. Maybe it's an IRA or a 401k, for example. You can ask the custodian who has that, maybe it's Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, for instance. You can ask them to withhold a certain percentage and send that directly to the IRS as a tax payment. If you're going to pay the taxes out of that account anyway, that can be an easy way to do it, but you might not want to pay the taxes out of those pre-tax accounts. Maybe you want to pay taxes from your taxable accounts, like your individual or your joint bank account instead. But withholding can be helpful. It's got some benefits. For example, it's treated as having been received by the IRS throughout the year. So if you're behind on taxes, that can be a way to maybe save things at the end of the year. The other method is the estimated payments. So you would pay throughout the year, typically quarterly, a certain amount to the IRS, and that's a portion of what you owe them for the year. With those quarterly payments, the timing does matter more. So you need to pay at different intervals, and they've got the dates on the IRS website. They're a little bit different from the traditional quarters, January, April, October, etc. So you want to look that up. But the idea is to pay the taxes in the period in which you received the income. So for example, if you have a lot of income early in the year, or you do a big Roth conversion early in the year, then you would want to presumably pay more estimated taxes in those early periods, those early quarters, or maybe try and do something later in the year with withholding. But the idea is you pay as you go so you don't owe, is how the IRS puts it. And that's important, because if you don't, then you can owe taxes and penalties. They say you underpaid, you didn't pay on time, or you didn't pay enough. Maybe you thought you didn't have to pay at all. What can end up happening is you owe not only the taxes that you were supposed to pay, but then there can be additional money due on top of that, and that's not something anybody wants. So that is some logistics on taxes. Now let's talk about what affects how much you actually owe. Here's where you need to start understanding the different types of income and different types of accounts. You've got income that might be ordinary income. You've got capital gains if you sell something at a gain for more than you paid for it, for example. All of this is going to affect your taxes differently. A couple of things to keep in mind are the types of accounts that you might have and the types of income you're getting. So your traditional pre-tax IRAs and 401ks, those generally kick out ordinary income. So when you take a withdrawal from those accounts, it's typically treated as ordinary income, which is very similar to the income you earned while you're working. It can be taxed at the higher rates. The higher your income gets, the higher the rate you're going to pay on. You've also got those Roth accounts, which can kick out tax-free income if you meet all of the IRS requirements. So you didn't get a deduction when you put the money in, but when you take it back out, again, assuming you meet the requirements, then that money can come out tax-free. So it doesn't cause you to pay more in taxes. It doesn't cause you to miss out on deductions or have to pay more for Medicare, etc. That can be very nice. HSAs can also be very similar if you are using the money for qualified medical expense. You've also got your taxable accounts. This is your plain vanilla, maybe a brokerage account or even your bank accounts, individual and joint accounts. With those, you didn't get any tax benefit when you put money in, and you don't get the tax-deferred growth. What happens instead is that all of the income you're getting throughout the year, maybe you're getting some interest, maybe you're selling things at a gain for capital gains, maybe your investments are kicking off dividends. All of that gets reported each year, typically on a 1099. So you report that income, and then you end up owing a little bit of tax on, or maybe a lot of tax on the income that you got from those investments each year. But you don't wait until the end. Like with the pre-tax IRA, for example, on that, you kind of wait until the end because all the dividends and interest and all that are not taxed as you get them. It's only when you withdraw the money, take it out and put it in your bank account for spending. That's when the taxes are due. But with a taxable brokerage account or your bank account, your CDs at the bank, savings account, those are kicking off interest that you have to report each year. So there is a difference on what type of account you're using, what kind of investments are in the account. All of this affects your taxes in retirement. Now, once you understand what those different types of accounts are and the different types of income, then you start to say, well, which accounts should I be drawing money from when I need money to spend? Or what else could I be doing strategically for my taxes? The traditional rule of thumb has been to spend down your taxable accounts first. So the taxable brokerage account, spend down your bank accounts, and then move on to tax-deferred accounts. So the pre-tax IRAs, 401ks, etc. So you're holding off on paying the tax on those. And then finally moving to the Roth type accounts or tax-free income. So the idea there being that you would pay as little tax as possible by spending from the taxable brokerage accounts. Yeah, maybe you have capital gains, but a lot of it is a return of your own capital. So it might not be taxable income. So you're trying to minimize taxes. Then you get into the tax deferred and you pay all the taxes on that. And then you got tax-free income at the end. That can make sense in some cases, but it's not always the best way to go. In fact, sometimes in that early period when you're trying to pay no taxes, it seems really appealing. I don't want to pay taxes. I'm just going to spend that money that generates zero tax liability. During that period, it might actually be smart to strategically take income. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One is to do Roth conversions, and that's where you convert money from these pre-tax tax-deferred accounts over into Roth money that'll ideally be tax-free later in life. And if your income's really low, you've stopped working, you don't have a lot of other sources of income, maybe Social Security hasn't started yet, that can really be beneficial because you can potentially take that income, you do a conversion, you're taking that as income, whatever you convert, you're taking that income generally at relatively low income tax rates, or at least that's the idea. Same goes with just withdrawing the money from those tax-deferred accounts. If you need money to spend, you might generate that money by selling things in those tax-deferred accounts, take the money out, and maybe even pay the taxes out of your bank accounts and your taxable brokerage account. There's no rigid rule on how you do that, but for all of this, you're going to be looking at, well, how much income, how much forced income am I getting from the bank accounts and the taxable account? If they're putting out a lot of interest and dividends, and maybe that's an issue to be aware of. Or what are my future distributions going to look like? Remember that the IRS requires you to start taking money out of those tax-deferred accounts, those pre-tax IRAs and 401ks in your 70s. So you can't leave that money tax-deferred indefinitely. You will eventually have to start taking the money out and then claiming it as income and paying tax on that income. So it might, again, make sense to take some of that income earlier. And then another thing to keep in mind is what's called IRMAA surcharges. These are extra amounts you might have to pay each month on your Medicare, depending on how high your income is. If it's above certain levels, you have to pay more each month. So again, if those RMDs, those required minimum distributions in your 70s, get to be quite large, then you may have some issues down the road. Now, this isn't to scare you or anything like that. A lot of people don't have issues, and for a lot of people, it's a nice problem to have. But in some cases, there are some strategic moves you can make that are helpful. Ultimately, the way I think about it is there's probably a better and a worse source of income each year, and you kind of take this year by year or looking a couple of years in advance, but you have to figure it out as you go. I've got other videos on those topics, so check the library for those. But you want to get a little bit strategic if you can. Yeah, one other thing on tax strategy I didn't mention yet is the so-called widow's tax trap. And that is where maybe you got a married couple and they can have, up to this much income in a certain tax bracket. Well, if one of the spouses dies, all of a sudden that level drops. The amount of income you can have in a given tax bracket or the amount of income you can have before you start paying those IRMAA surcharges, the higher Medicare costs. So that can be an issue as well. Just look ahead when you do your planning. Be sure to look at what happens if one spouse dies quite a bit earlier than the other. It can happen unexpectedly. So check out next year, 5 years, 10 years, etc. what might happen to everybody's tax bracket and their Medicare cost. Then we get into how much you can or should spend, and this gets really tricky. So there are some rules of thumb that try to help you figure out how much you can spend. The 4% rule is, of course, one of the most famous, or notorious, I should say. It's debatable. So it's a nice way of getting an idea of how much could you spend, roughly how much might you need, but it is highly imperfect. It ignores a lot of things, in particular taxes. All right, so it's not taking that into account. It's not taking into account the fact that spending is often lumpy in retirement. So you might not want to spend the exact same amount each month, or there's timing issues with when Social Security comes in. So you might need to withdraw at a higher rate for a number of years. And then once Social Security starts, you're at a much lower rate. You can't really capture that with a rule of thumb. It also has some risk of underspending. In more than half of the cases, you end up with more than twice as much as you started with under historical research. That, again, the past is not the future. There's no guarantee that things will unfold the way they went in the past. But the idea here is that it's probably not the right way to figure out how much to spend each month. A much better way to go is to make a plan to figure out how much could you afford to spend, or what is it you want to spend, and can you do that, and can you hopefully spend more than that? And the best way to think about income is to be flexible. So if you can increase or decrease your spending based on what the markets are giving you, then that's often helpful, because you may be able to give yourself a raise over time, or you may need to cut your spending a little bit if things get tight, but that may be temporary. It might be a smaller cut than you expected, but doing that can help you perhaps start at a higher spending level than you otherwise would with, let's say, the 4% rule. And then you say, all right, but if things get bad, I'll make some changes. And realistically, that's what I see clients doing. They're often contacting me before they even need to make a cut and saying, yeah, I think I want to reduce spending a little bit. So people tend to do that naturally. I don't think that's, something that's hugely out of the ordinary for people, but keep it in mind as you make your plan. Then making a plan is always easy, but people always have in the back of their mind, yeah, but what about long-term care? What about those big healthcare events and expenses? And that is really one of the most difficult parts of retirement planning. So a couple of ways to address that. You might say, what resources are there to pay for long-term care? First, you can just look at your assets. What do I have saved and set aside for retirement? Would that cover, let's say, $10,000 a month for 2 years or for 5 years or whatever the case may be? Or do I have home equity, a paid off home? And most importantly, am I and everybody else who is involved in the situation here, are we able to move out of that house, or can we tap the equity through a reverse mortgage? What are the different options with that home equity? Or what are some insurance options? Are we willing to pay some money or set some money aside, slice it off and give it to an insurance company? These are all things you want to look at if that's a concern for you, and it is a very real concern. Then inflation is also a biggie. So your plan does need to account for the fact that prices have tended to rise over time. So your withdrawals generally need to rise over time. Now, keep in mind a reality here, and I've got other videos on this, is that for retirees, their spending doesn't necessarily rise in lockstep with inflation. There are a couple of things that happen. One is you have the go-go years, then the slow-go years, and the no-go years, where you're spending the most when you just retired. You're more active. You want to take those trips. You want to do everything you've been waiting to do. Then things get a little bit simpler in the slow-go years. You have less energy. You've done a lot of the things you want to do. And then in the no-go years, healthcare might be the main thing, and you're not super mobile. You're still enjoying yourself, but you're not, jet setting or anything like that. The other type of spending reality is what's known as the retirement spending smile. And what that is essentially inflation minus 1%. So inflation causes your prices to rise and your withdrawals need to rise, but your actual withdrawals as a retiree might be able to rise a little bit slower, maybe 1% less than inflation each year. So if inflation was 3% a year, your costs might rise at about 2% a year, or at least some costs. You might want to have your healthcare costs inflating at an even faster rate. But these are things to think about as you make your plan. What inflation rate? What about healthcare? And if you focus on those scary things, you might end up sitting at home and not spending a penny. And that's not what we want. It's important to always remember life is short. Tomorrow's not guaranteed. Anything can happen with your health or an accident. You have worked hard and saved up that money, and it's important to enjoy your savings. If you underspend, it's not just that you end up with a bunch of money, but you have missed out on some experiences, making some memories, being able to help other people, doing fun stuff. It's just not ideal to hold money aside that you could safely and very reasonably spend. I know that it's extremely scary. I really do. So it is hard to find that balance, but I think you really want to work hard at finding that balance and pushing yourself to maybe spend a teeny bit more, at least with the people I see. I know it's all types of different people out there, but the people that I typically work with, they are more likely to be underspending than overspending in retirement. So try to find that balance. You're not going to get it perfect, but you can adjust as you go. So figure it out year by year, make some changes, try some things, and see how it goes. And that is ultimately the more important thing about living off your savings in retirement. There's the logistical stuff we talked about earlier, but that's pretty easy once you figure that out, and you can almost automate it in many cases. The more important thing is figuring out how do you actually make the most of this and enjoy it. And even the tax stuff, I think, is less important, although people really get hung up on that. I want you to enjoy your savings, live your life. Remember, life can be short.